The courtroom buzzed with energy as Dr. Ebony Harris entered, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. "Dr. Harris, is it true you falsified your credentials?" The question hung in the tense atmosphere, the cameras flashing, reporters closing in, but Ebony Harris didn't flinch. The prosecution had labeled her a fraud. The media had painted her as a liar. No records, no past, no proof of who she truly was. But what if the truth was far more dangerous? What if her identity wasn't fake, but classified? Stay with me, because this case is about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. Lightning cracked across the horizon as dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the storm clouds flickering in and out of view, casting an eerie glow on the courthouse. The rain pattered on the steps, dotting the stone archways with dark circles that shimmered under the flickering overhead lights. Even at this early hour, the scene was charged. Reporters had already gathered, microphones in hand, eyes flicking nervously toward the building's entrance. Some sipped coffee, others exchanged hushed whispers of speculation. Everyone there knew one thing. This was no ordinary trial. The charges were extraordinary. The implications, enormous. The front page headline screamed the news. Fraud case shocks the Capitol. Mysterious woman on trial. Inside the courthouse, the hustle and bustle of the impending trial had already begun. Security officers escorted nervous witnesses through the halls, while attorneys in crisply pressed suits whispered final strategies to one another. The clack of high heels echoed against the polished marble floors, creating a chaotic symphony that mirrored the rising tension of the day. And at the center of it all was one name, Dr. Ebony Harris. At first glance, Ebony Harris didn't seem like a figure who would provoke such an uproar. She was neither flamboyant nor timid. In fact, everything about her suggested quiet strength. Standing just under 5.5 feet tall, she exuded a graceful confidence, her smooth dark complexion and regal posture hinting at an inner fortitude not easily shaken. At precisely 7:50 a.m., she stepped out of a black sedan, accompanied only by her attorney, Judith Reinhardt. Raindrops fell gently onto her polished black shoes, rolling off the shoulders of her perfectly tailored navy blue jacket. Her hair was neatly twisted, and her face carried only the slightest gloss on her lips, no makeup, no artifice. Even in the gloom of a stormy morning, her eyes shone with determination and focus. There was a quiet gravity about her, a presence that was felt more than seen. As soon as she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the media descended in a frenzy. The shutters of cameras snapped incessantly. Microphones were thrust forward like ravenous mouths, searching for a reaction, any hint of statement. If Ebony was affected by the chaos around her, she didn't show it. She simply raised her chin, her step steady, as she glided past the throng of reporters. The questions came relentlessly. "Dr. Harris, is it true you falsified your credentials? Why are you refusing to talk about your background? Are the rumors about a double life true?" Judith Reinhardt, her ever-present lawyer, did her best to deflect the barrage of questions, issuing a practice no comment with every step. Together, they moved forward, disappearing into the courthouse, leaving the reporters to gossip amongst themselves, hungry for any scrap of information they could catch. But no one except perhaps Ebony herself, knew the magnitude of the day's revelations. The true story, the one that would change everything, was about to unfold in a courtroom that was already buzzing with anticipation. By the time Dr. Harris and her attorney entered courtroom 4B, the room was packed. The walls were adorned with ornate wooden panels that gave the space a dignified, almost intimidating atmosphere. The gallery was filled with spectators, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. They had come for answers. What they didn't realize was that the truth was far more explosive than they could have ever imagined. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of unease, as curious civilians, media representatives, and a few of Ebony Harris's acquaintances filled the seats. Among the crowd, Ebony spotted some familiar faces. Old college classmates, distant relatives, and former colleagues, each of them casting her a look of confusion, betrayal, or disbelief. Her trial had drawn them in like moths to a flame, their eyes wide with uncertainty, trying to reconcile the woman they knew with the accusations that now surrounded her. At the front of the courtroom sat the presiding judge, the Honorable William Blaisdell. Known for his stern rulings and no-nonsense demeanor, Judge Blazel was a man whose very presence demanded respect. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly, and he peered down at the papers before him through rimless glasses, his expression unwavering. To his left and right, the American and state flags stood like silent sentinels, their colors bold against the solemnity of the room. Blazel's face betrayed neither sympathy nor hostility. It was the face of a man prepared to let the facts speak for themselves. On the left, the prosecution's table was stacked high with files, folders, and manila envelopes. A tall, wiry man in a dark suit, Assistant District Attorney Trevor Moore, sat with an air of measured confidence. Moore's broad shoulders and sharp stare communicated that he relished high-profile cases, the kind that could launch a lawyer's career to new heights. His expression was calm, but Ebony could sense the undercurrent of ambition stir behind his eyes, a hunger for victory that would not be easily satiated. On the right side of the room was the defense table. Aside from a few neatly organized files, Ebony and her lawyer, Judith Reinhardt, brought far fewer materials. The imbalance between the two tables was glaring, an unspoken acknowledgment of the daunting uphill battle ahead. With Ebony's silence on her own background, their evidence was limited. All they could do was rely on the labyrinth of classified truths that Ebony kept hidden, truths that could not easily be unveiled in a public court without incurring enormous risks. As the room settled into a tense quiet, Ebony and Judith quietly took their seats. Judith, ever watchful, leaned over to Ebony and whispered, "Are you okay?" Ebony flashed a tight but reassuring smile, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine." Beneath her calm exterior, however, her mind churned with the weight of the decisions ahead. Could she reveal even a fraction of the truth about who she really was? Would doing so jeopardize national security, or worse, land her in prison if she kept silent? These thoughts swirled in her mind, but she swallowed them, focusing instead on proceedings unfolding around her. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone in the room rose, including Ebony. Judge Blazel entered the courtroom with a slow, deliberate pace, surveying the space with an air of authority. He settled into his chair, made sure all were seated, and then, with a measured voice, began, in the matter of the District of Columbia versus Dr. Ebony Harris. He began, his words reverberating off the polished wooden surfaces. "We will begin proceedings today to address allegations of fraud, misrepresentation, and falsification credentials." A murmur swept across the gallery, but it was quickly silenced by a sharp glance from the bailiff. The stage was set. The day's revelations were about to begin. At precisely 8:30 a.m., Assistant District Attorney Trevor Moore stood to present the prosecution's opening statement. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle over the gallery. "Your Honor," Moore began, turned to face Judge Blazel. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we stand here today to examine charges of fraud and deliberate misrepresentation perpetrated by Dr. Ebony Harris. We have evidence that shows Dr. Harris has systematically lied about her professional history, her academic degrees, and even her very identity." A collective intake of breath resonated across the gallery, and Ebony's gaze locked onto Moore. Her posture remained unmoving, but inside, a tide of indignation stirred. How dare he? How dare he paint her as a fraud, when the truth of who she was went far beyond the surface of his accusations? Moore pressed on, undeterred by the tension in the room. "This is not a simple oversight or an administrative error," he continued. "We allege that Dr. Harris claims advanced degrees from institutions that have no record of her enrollment. She claims to have held significant positions at research foundations that do not appear in any official databases. The question is not whether Dr. Harris lied," Moore's voice sharpened, "but why? What does she have to hide?" Judith Reinhardt stood immediately to object, but Moore was unflustered, continuing with the unwavering confidence of a man determined to win. "We will show, through documented testimony and expert analysis, that Dr. Harris's entire background is fabricated." The courtroom held its breath as Moore's words echoed in the room. The fight had only just begun. The air in the courtroom thickened as Assistant District Attorney Moore's voice echoed with confidence. "Witnesses and direct evidence will show that Dr. Ebony Harris constructed an elaborate web of deception," he declared, his words dripping with conviction. The defense may try to claim that this is a matter of national security, he added, his sneer accentuating the dramatic effect. But make no mistake, this is just a smoke screen. By the end of this trial, we expect a guilty verdict that will remind everyone that no one is above the law. Moore took his seat, and almost tangible silence fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the judge, who now looked at Judith Reinhardt, waiting for her rebuttal. The weight of expectation was clear. Her opening statement would need to counter Moore's dramatic entrance. Judith stepped up to the podium, cleared her throat, and faced the jury. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice steady but firm, "this case is far more complicated than it may seem. We intend to prove that Dr. Harris is not the fraud the prosecution claims. The alleged inconsistencies in her background are not due to deceit or forgery. Instead, they are the result of her extensive service in a role that, for the most part, remains classified." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. The claim was bold, especially considering Ebony's refusal to discuss her background outside of closed chambers. Could her life truly be so secret that even a partial confirmation was too dangerous to reveal? Judith continued, unshaken by the growing whispers. "We will demonstrate that many of the so-called discrepancies in Dr. Harris's past are, in fact, by design. They are measures put in place to protect Dr. Harris's safety and to safeguard ongoing national interests." Judith's words hung in the air, challenging the prosecution's narrative. Her assertion was risky, but it was the only path they could take given the evidence, or lack thereof, that they had. "We understand the prosecution believes it is ironclad evidence," she continued, "but we will show that the absence of records is not proof of wrongdoing. Rather, it can be evidence of carefully protected information." She paused, letting the gravity of her statement settle over the courtroom. "We have faith that once the truth is fully understood, this court will find Dr. Harris not guilty of any criminal conduct." With her final words, Judith quietly returned to her seat, placing a reassuring hand on Ebony's shoulder. Ebony's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, betraying no hint of fear. Whatever happened in the coming days would define the rest of her life. Beneath the table, her hands clenched in silent prayer, hoping her quiet sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. During the mid-morning recess, the courthouse corridors buzzed with speculation. Journalists huddled together, comparing notes, analyzing the drastically different portrayals offered by the prosecution and the defense. Some tried to piece together Ebony's known history, flipping through aged newspaper clippings or scouring her limited, now scrutinized, social media posts. Yet, despite their best efforts, they found very little that made sense. Behind closed doors, Ebony paced in a small consultation room. The gray walls and rectangular wooden table with plastic chairs created a stark, uninspiring space. Judith sat with her arms folded, her eyes following Ebony's restless steps. "I need you to trust me," she said softly, breaking the silence. "This is only the first day. There's still time to introduce evidence, to request closed sessions if necessary. The judge just has to be convinced of the legitimacy of your claims." Ebony nodded absently, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand, but there's only so much I can disclose without risking lives, mine included. I made an oath when I joined the agency." Judith gave a slow, empathetic sigh. "I've spoken with a few contacts, Ebony. They said it's nearly impossible for us to get those classified documents declassified in time. The government bureaucracy moves at a glacial pace, especially with something so sensitive." Ebony's expression tightened. She had trained for many things in her covert career, everything from infiltration and interrogation to resistance and crisis management. But standing defenseless before a court that demanded proof of her identity was not something she had ever prepared for. "I know," she replied, "but let's see what we can do." They returned to the courtroom, uncertain about how the day's testimony would unfold, but resolved to face it head-on. Ebony settled into her seat at the defense table, bracing herself for the parade of witnesses the prosecution had lined up. The very first witness was a sign of just how high-profile the trial had become. The prosecution called Dr. Mallory Duquois, a well-known expert in the field. The courtroom held its breath as the first witness took the stand, and the trial continued to unfold in ways no one could have anticipated. Dr. Mallory Duquois was widely regarded as one of the best forensic academic credentials analysts in her field. Known for her meticulous attention to detail, she had built a reputation for being able to either confirm or debunk a person's claimed educational background with precision. As she took her seat on the witness stand, she smoothed her collared blouse, adjusted her glasses, and, after being sworn in, nodded respectfully at the judge. Moore wasted no time. Dr. Duquois, could you please describe your findings regarding the academic records of Dr. Ebony Harris? Dr. Duquois consulted her notes carefully before responding. After a thorough investigation, we could find no official transcripts or enrollment records for Dr. Ebony Harris at the universities where she claims to have earned her degrees. The registrar's offices at each institution have confirmed, in writing, that they have no record of any student by that name, nor by any other name who attended or graduated during the relevant years. Moore nodded slowly, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. In your professional opinion, he continued, is this indicative of an administrative error? Administrative errors can occur, Dr. Duquois answered, but to have zero records at multiple institutions where Dr. Harris purportedly studied is extraordinarily unlikely. It suggests that her stated academic credentials are, at best, unverifiable, and at worst, they are fabricated entirely. A ripple of unease spread to the spectators. Ebony kept her composure, but inside her chest tightened. She had earned those degrees, but they were concealed under layers of official cover identities. To reveal them would mean unsealing top-secret files, something the government had yet to do, and might never do, especially in an open court. The defense had no immediate way to challenge the thoroughness of Dr. Duquois' analysis. Judith Reinhardt stood for cross-examination, offering questions that hinted at the existence of sealed records and special circumstances. But the academic analyst's stone-cold data remained unimpeachable. From a purely civilian standpoint, there was no flaw in her findings. The second witness was Elliot Morgan, a man who claimed to have once employed Ebony at a private research foundation. He insisted that Ebony had never worked there, that her name did not appear on any staff logs, payroll rosters, or project documents. We cross-checked everything, Morgan declared firmly. She didn't exist in our system. One after another, the prosecution's witnesses hammer home the same overarching theme. Ebony's professional history could not be validated using standard procedures. To the average observer, it appeared damning. Under normal circumstances, Ebony might have vigorously contested each point, but these were not normal circumstances. The usual tools for defense, public records, letters of recommendation, personal contacts, were unavailable to someone whose career was by design shrouded in secrecy. By the time the day's session concluded, the gallery was rife with speculation. Some whispered that Ebony was a world-class scammer who had finally been caught. Others insisted she was some kind of hidden asset, though that viewpoint was less common and met with suspicion. As Ebony walked out of the courthouse that evening, she held her head high, though inside, she questioned just how long she could keep her secrets hidden before they ultimately destroyed her life. That night, in a nondescript apartment she had rented temporarily near the courthouse, Ebony lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. A single lamp on the bedside table cast a soft orange glow across the walls, flickering gently in the darkness. Her mind wandered back to the memories of her first steps into the covert world she had dedicated her life to. Flashback. Years ago, a younger Ebony Harris stepped off a bus at a rural Virginia depot. Farmland stretched in all directions, rolling hills, dense clusters of trees, and a wide open sky. This was Camp Perry, colloquially known as a farm, the CIA's clandestine training facility. Dressed in plain workout clothes, Ebony was greeted by an instructor who simply pointed to a row of identical black SUVs parked near a dirt road. Basic training was about to begin, and the intensity of what lay ahead would demand everything she had. Ebony recalled the pre-dawn runs that tested her endurance, the immersive language labs, and the countless hours spent analyzing scenario after scenario of plausible deniability. She remembered the hush-hush nature of it all, the constant reminders from her instructors not to speak of the farm or her training to anyone, under penalty of law. They relentlessly emphasized that their identities must remain fluid, their backgrounds adaptable. For an intelligence officer, the hallmark of success was invisibility. Before entering the farm, Ebony had already earned advanced degrees in international relations and cryptography through specialized government-sponsored programs, where her presence was concealed behind code names. But the CIA required more. She had to become a phantom, a ghost who could move seamlessly between aliases. That was how she learned to operate, and that was how she would eventually rise through the ranks. Now, in the present, Ebony turned onto her side, glancing at her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. She wondered if the CIA had abandoned her or if they were simply watching from a distance, ready to intervene if matters escalated beyond repair. 1,000 thoughts weighed heavily on her mind as the storm outside rattled the apartment window. Finally, she closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day claim her. The next morning dawned with a calmer sky. The rain had given way to crisp sunlight, the air tangy with the aftertaste of the passing storm. Despite the improved weather, the courthouse was no less tense. In fact, the crowd had doubled as more journalists piled in, determined to seize exclusive angles on Ebony's case. Inside the building, Ebony sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly. As the judge took his seat, the bailiff announced the start of the new session, and Moore, the prosecutor, rose with a smug expression. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Miss Deborah Byrne to the stand," Moore declared. Deborah Byrne was introduced as a background investigator who specialized in verifying credentials of government contractors. Under oath, she walked the jury through a process of checking Ebony Harris's references for each alleged contractor role Dr. Harris claimed to have held. "We found no supporting evidence that she served in any capacity. Either the contracting firms did not exist, or they had no records of her involvement," Byrne stated, flipping through her notepad. Moore offered a polite smile and turned to the jury, letting Byrne's testimony resonate. Her words painted Ebony as a meticulous liar, someone who had carefully fabricated a resume to gain lucrative positions. The story was sensational, and if the defense could not provide a counter-narrative, Ebony would be sunk. Judith Reinhardt stood for cross-examination, her calm demeanor betraying no sign of the tension that Ebony could feel building. Scanning notes on her yellow legal pad, Judith addressed Byrne. "Miss Byrne, is it not possible that records of Dr. Harris's service exist in a secure government system, one you have no clearance to access?" Byrne faltered for a moment, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I suppose that's possible," she replied. "But standard security procedures for contractors do not typically involve erasing public records or standard reference logs." Judith pressed on, her voice firm. "Unless the person in question was working in a classified capacity, correct? In which case, those references might be locked behind security clearances that even you do not possess." Moore objected, claiming Judith was leading the witness, but the judge overruled him, somewhat intrigued by the direction of the question. Byrne, visibly uncomfortable, answered, "Yes, theoretically that could happen." Judith nodded slightly, a small victory in the midst of a tense battle. But the damage had already been done. In the eyes of the public, Ebony's story was seemingly absent from civilian life. The idea of a hidden, highly classified career still seemed too intangible, even far-fetched, to many observers. Later that day, Ebony was surprised to find her mother, Charlotte Harris, sitting alone in the back row of the gallery. Charlotte had always been a warm woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. Her presence there, in the midst of such a high-stakes trial, sent a wave of emotion through Ebony. Despite the circumstances, her mother's calm, reassuring gaze was the one constant in a world that had suddenly become too chaotic to navigate alone. Ebony had long kept her mother in the dark about her covert work, shielding her from potential fallout. But now, as Charlotte's face reflected a mix of worry and confusion, Ebony knew the time had come for a conversation she had dreaded. When the court recessed for lunch, Ebony quietly approached her mother. "Mom," she said softly, "you shouldn't have come." Charlotte's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, her voice trembling with emotion. "Baby, I had to. The whole community is talking about this, wondering how much of it is true. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail." Ebony gently placed a hand on her mother's shoulder, guiding her away from the bustling corridor and to a quieter corner. "I'm sorry," Ebony whispered. "I didn't want you to worry." In that moment, Ebony appeared more like a vulnerable daughter than ever before. She swallowed hard, the weight of guilt gnawing at her insides. I can't explain everything, but just know I'm not lying about who I am. Charlotte studied her daughter's face, searching her eyes for the truth. Then why don't you just tell them the truth? Show them the proof. And this nonsense. The desperation in Charlotte's voice was heartbreaking, and Ebony glanced away, hating how she had to guard the truth so fiercely. It's not that simple, Mom, Ebony replied, her voice tight with the burden of her secrets. There are people, powerful people, who need my work to remain confidential. National security is on the line. A single tear escaped down Charlotte's cheek. She quickly dabbed it away with a handkerchief, but her voice was soft with fear. I believe you, Ebony, but I'm scared for you. I'm scared for us. Ebony wrapped her arms around her mother in a tender embrace, offering the only comfort she could in that moment. She couldn't reveal more, but for that fleeting moment, the emotional distance she had kept for years softened, allowing her mother's love to fill the space between them. When the lunch break ended and they returned to the courtroom, Ebony's mind was still heavy with thoughts of her mother. She wondered if there was a way to protect her secrets while also safeguarding her own freedom. Yet, she remembered some of the operations she had been a part of. If those files were declassified, it wouldn't just reveal her identity. It would expose alliances, methods, and possibly burn foreign assets. One memory came rushing back to her with vivid clarity. In the smoky back room of a cafe in Eastern Europe, Ebony had brokered a meeting with a deep-cover informant, risking her own safety. She recalled the tense wait to see if the coded signals they exchanged would be enough to earn his trust. That operation had led to the dismantling of a major terrorist cell before it could strike a U.S. embassy overseas. The formal records of that mission bore a different name entirely for Ebony, and even her physical description had been altered in official documents. Only a handful of top-level CIA officers knew her true role in the operation. How could she possibly expose such intricately concealed details now, just to save herself from a fraud charge? With a heavy sigh, she forced her mind back to the present. The prosecution had just called another witness, clearly aiming to drive the final nails into Ebony's coffin. Jeff Carlton was the star witness of the afternoon, a former colleague from Ebony's earliest days at a small Washington think tank, the Rutherford Institute for Global Policy. At least, that was the cover story she had used during her brief tenure there. Carlton, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, approached the witness stand with the cautious air of someone torn between telling the truth and sparing an old colleague. Mr. Carlton, Moore began, his voice sharp, you stated in your deposition that Dr. Harris performed tasks at the Rutherford Institute for Global Policy that seemed out of the ordinary. Could you elaborate? Carlton cleared his throat, refusing to meet Ebony's gaze as he spoke. Yes, Ebony, or at least that's the name she went by, arrived out of nowhere. The institute was small, focused on academic research, but Ebony seemed far more intense. She asked unusual questions, delving into aspects of foreign policy that bordered on intelligence gathering. Then one day, she disappeared. HR had no record of her leaving. She just vanished. The words hit Ebony like a wave, but she remained still, her expression unreadable. Every word, every accusation, dug deeper into the carefully crafted web she had spent years weaving. The courtroom held its breath as Carlton's testimony continued, each detail drawing a tighter noose around her carefully guarded secrets. The entire situation felt increasingly strange as Carlton spoke, recounting the details. Moore leaned in, eager to press further. Did you or any of your co-workers verify Dr. Harris's credentials at the time? We tried, Carlton admitted reluctantly. We called the university she listed. Nothing. The phone numbers for her references led nowhere. A few of us suspected she might be some kind of infiltrator, but we never imagined she was lying for personal gain. It always felt more clandestine. Carlton's testimony triggered excited whispers throughout the gallery. Moore stepped away from the podium, letting his words sink in before pivoting. But that's speculation, he said, his voice growing sharper. What we do know is that Dr. Harris had no legitimate work record at this institute, correct? Carlton hesitated, his discomfort evident. In terms of official payroll or HR documents, correct. There was no record. Moore offered a thin smile of triumph. Thank you, Mr. Carlton. Judith's cross-examination sought to highlight the possibility that Ebony had been placed at the Rutherford Institute by a government agency, implying that the unusual tasks she performed weren't for personal gain, but for official reasons. However, without concrete proof, her argument rang hollow in the jury's ears. Outside the courthouse, reporters hungrily consumed these revelations, and the narrative quickly shifted. Where once in a case about Ebony being a con artist now portrayed her as a rogue government spy, one who had overstepped legal boundaries. By the end of the day, Ebony's reputation hung precariously in the balance. Her secrets, once carefully guarded, were being torn apart in the public eye. That evening, as Ebony sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed. She frowned at the unrecognized number, but answered anyway, stepping out onto the balcony for privacy. The cool night air brushed against her face as she lifted the phone to her ear. Dr. Harris, this is Mark Delaney, Office of Security at the George Bush Center for Intelligence. A jolt of adrenaline surged through Ebony at the sound of his voice. Delaney was a name she'd heard whispered in the agency's corridors, a high-ranking official responsible for internal security. If he was calling her directly, it either meant she was in serious trouble, or perhaps there was a lifeline. I've been following your case, Delaney continued. It seems we have a problem. Ebony closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. That's putting it lightly, sir. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. You have your reasons for silence, but let me assure you, you're not abandoned. The agency is working the back channels to see if we can expedite certain disclosures. But as you know, everything must go through the proper channels. We got stakeholders with concerns about revealing operational details in open court. Ebony gripped the balcony railing, her knuckles turning white. The wind rustled her hair, but it did little to ease the storm brewing inside her. So, what am I supposed to do? Just stand by while they crucify me in public? I could go to prison. Delaney's voice remained calm and measured. Trust the process for now. If it looks like you're on the verge of a guilty verdict, we'll intervene. But the agency would prefer a resolution that doesn't require us to expose ongoing operations. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful at the moment. Ebony wanted to scream in frustration, but she kept her composure. After all these years of service, after risking her life for the agency, was she truly expendable? I understand, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, the weight of her thoughts heavy in the silence. Thank you. Hold the line a bit longer, Delaney advised. We're doing what we can. Then the line went dead. Ebony stayed on the balcony for a long time, staring at the glimmering lights of the city, torn between betrayal and relief. The CIA was aware at least, but the lingering question remained. Would they act in time? Word spread quickly of the new rumors linking Ebony to intelligence work. In response, the prosecution filed additional motions to force Ebony to reveal any government affiliations. They argued that if Ebony were truly a CIA operative, she should have official paperwork to prove it. If she couldn't produce such documentation, it would only support their fraud claims. Judge Blaisdell scheduled a closed-door meeting in his chambers to address the matter. Present were Ebony, Judith, Moore, and the judge himself. Blaisdell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, as the tension in the room grew thicker by the second. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, his piercing eyes locked onto Ebony. Dr. Harris, he began, his voice steady but stern. The prosecution has raised a significant point. If you are affiliated with U.S. intelligence, you presumably have documentation to that effect, albeit classified. However, you cannot simply claim that everything is secret and expect the court to overlook potential wrongdoing. Our justice system does not function on blind trust. Judith quickly spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, we've made requests to the relevant agencies, but we've been informed there are national security considerations that prevent us from providing documentation at this time. Moore scoffed, clearly impatient. In other words, she's stalling. She claims to be an operative, but conveniently cannot provide any proof. A flare of anger rose in Ebony's chest at Moore's arrogance. She wanted to lash out, to condemn him for his dismissive attitude, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Your Honor," Ebony said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her, "I respect the court and the law. However, I have responsibilities that extend beyond myself. Revealing certain aspects of my background could place others in danger. I'm requesting more time in a secure environment in which to present my bona fides." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression pensive as he considered her request. A frown crossed his face as he weighed the implications of granting such an extension. "I'll grant a 2-day extension," he finally said, his voice firm. "If by then you cannot at least demonstrate enough evidence to warrant a classified review, I will have no choice but to proceed with the trial as is. Is that understood?" Ebony's shoulders relaxed slightly. It was a small victory, but it was something. "Yes, Your Honor." Moore looked displeased, but he said nothing as the group dispersed from the judge's chambers and returned to the main courtroom for more procedural matters. Despite the temporary reprieve, Ebony felt the sands of time slipping through her fingers. 2 days to prove her identity in a way that didn't compromise national security. Was it even possible? Outside the courthouse, Ebony was met by a firestorm of paparazzi. The swirl of camera flashes and shouted questions was suffocating. She kept her head bowed, stepping through the crowd with Judith close behind. One question cut through the chaos, sharp and pointed. "Ebony, if you really are CIA, why won't they save you?" The barb echoed in her mind. It was a question everyone was asking, and her predicament seemed to confirm the worst suspicions, that she was either a liar or someone who had broken some rules so severe that even the CIA wouldn't acknowledge her. The truth, of course, was far more nuanced, but nuance was lost amid the sensational headlines. Back in her apartment, Ebony flicked on the television, her curiosity getting the better of her. News channels were broadcasting panel discussions about her trial, featuring talking heads debating the plausibility of her CIA affiliation. Terms like deep state rogue operative and government conspiracy were tossed around casually, and the trial had quickly become a national spectacle. Scrolling through social media, Ebony saw hashtags like #EbonyHarris and #FrauderSpy trending. Memes mocked her supposed double life, while others asked pointed questions about race and systemic bias. Would a white man claiming a CIA background receive the same immediate skepticism? The question stung in a surge of mixed emotions, anger, sadness, resignation, churned inside her. She threw her phone onto the couch in frustration, longing for the simpler anonymity of her past missions. She wished she could slip into an alias and vanish, but this fight was unavoidable. If she ran, she would confirm the prosecution's narrative. If she stayed, she might destroy the secrecy she had fought so hard to protect. Both choices felt like an impossible gamble. As Ebony prepared her statements for the next day, her phone rang again. This time, the number was undisclosed. She answered cautiously, bracing for another prime reporter or an ominous threat. To her surprise, the voice on the other end belonged to none other than Trevor Moore, the very prosecutor targeting her in court. "Dr. Harris," he said, his tone clipped and professional, "I'd like to extend a plea deal before we go any further." Ebony's eyebrows shot up. "I'm listening." "There's a lot of attention on this case," Moore continued, his words slow and deliberate. "If you plead guilty to the lesser charge of perjury, we'll drop the major fraud counts. You'll likely receive probation, maybe less." The offer hung in the air, and Ebony's mind raced. Would this be the escape she needed? Or was this just another trap? Community service? You get a slap on the wrist, and everyone can move on. A best-case scenario for you, given the evidence. Moore's voice was sharp, almost taunting. Ebony's jaw tightened. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do." Moore's tone shifted, growing colder and more calculated. "The alternative is a potentially long prison sentence if we secure a conviction. You see how this is going. The so-called CIA angle isn't helping you. These next 2 days are your last window." Ebony's heart pounded in her chest. "I'm aware," she replied, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "Thank you, but no." The line disconnected abruptly. Ebony stood there for a moment, her breath shaky as she exhaled. The offer was tempting. In a practical sense, avoiding the risk of a lengthy sentence was appealing, but accepting it would also be insulting. It would brand her a liar, forever tarnishing her reputation and overshadowing the years of service she had truly given to her country. Outside, the night seemed to press in on her cramped apartment. Ebony squared her shoulders, steeling herself. She might have no official help, but she would see this through. One way or another, the truth would come out. The next morning, Ebony made her way back to the courthouse, dread swirling in her stomach. Time was running out, and she knew that a decisive intervention was desperately needed. As she entered the lobby, she was startled to see a familiar figure standing by the security checkpoint. Mark Delaney, the CIA security official who had called her just days before. He was dressed in a conservative dark suit, his expression serious and resolute. Ebony approached him cautiously. "Mr. Delaney," she greeted him, her voice subdued. He nodded curtly. "We've managed to obtain a sealed file that we can present to the judge. We can't disclose everything, but it should be enough to establish your legitimacy." Ebony's relief was so profound it nearly buckled her knees. She whispered, "Thank you." Delaney held up a hand, cautioning her. "Don't thank me yet. There are still major concerns about how much we're revealing, even in a sealed session. Not everyone in Langley is on board with this, and if the judge refuses a closed hearing, we may have to invoke certain privileges that could complicate your case further." Ebony shook his hand, not caring about the bureaucracy or the political maneuvers happening behind the scenes. The fact that her superiors were providing any support at all felt like a lifeline. Together, they headed toward the corridor outside the judge's chambers, where Ebony's defense team was already waiting. The prosecution eyed Delaney suspiciously, but followed them into the judge's private office for the scheduled meeting. Judge Blaisdell sat behind his desk in the cramped, wood-paneled office. With a glance at Moore and Judith, he motioned for everyone to sit. Delaney remained standing, a sealed envelope in hand, the corners marked with the official CIA insignia. Blaisdell's tone was measured. "Mr. Delaney, you have some evidence to present?" Delaney handed over the envelope, his expression calm but resolute. "These are top-secret documents verifying Dr. Harris's employment history and her responsibilities within the Central Intelligence Agency. They are only to be viewed by you, Your Honor, and should remain sealed from the public record." Moore's jaw tightened. "Your Honor," the prosecution objects. "We have had no opportunity to review these documents ourselves." Delaney's expression hardened. "Their classification is top-secret SCI. Under no circumstances can these documents be made available for public or general prosecutorial review. They are eyes only for those with the appropriate clearance. Your Honor may confirm their validity, but the content cannot be disseminated." Blaisdell glanced at Ebony, studying her for a moment, before carefully opening the envelope. As his eyes scanned the first page, he turned each page slowly, as though absorbing something far beyond his expectations. The color seemed to drain from his face, his expression betraying a mix of disbelief and realization, as if he had glimpsed a hidden world he never suspected could exist. Every so often, he paused to look up at Delaney, his brow furrowed, as though questioning the gravity of what he was reading. The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. No one could quite fathom the significance of the documents that lay in front of the judge, except perhaps Delaney, who stood there unmoved, his resolve unshaken. He exhaled sharply, furrowing his brow, and when he finally looked up, his expression was grave. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I see, Mr. Delaney. These materials, they appear authentic. They corroborate certain claims made by the defense. I assume you can verify them." "Yes, Your Honor," Delaney replied without hesitation. "I certify that Dr. Ebony Harris holds one of the highest security clearances in the agency and has served with distinction in multiple critical operations." The judge lowered the file, his gaze fixed on the contents for a moment. "I'm going to need time to consider how to proceed," he said, his voice steady but contemplative. "The question remains whether we can use this information in open court without jeopardizing national security." He paused before adding, "For now, I'm inclined to call a recess while I consult with appropriate channels." Moore, looking livid, rose to protest. "But, Your Honor, the prosecution hasn't been allowed to see." Blaisdell cut him off with a stern glance, his voice firm. "That's enough, Mr. Moore. Until I determine a protocol for handling classified material in these proceedings, you will not have access." Ebony felt a wave of relief wash over her. Perhaps, at last, the tide was turning in her favor. She offered Delaney a small nod of gratitude, and he responded with a barely perceptible tilt of his head. They had only managed to open a crack in the wall of secrecy, but it might be just enough to save her. Word of the judge receiving a top-secret CIA file on Ebony Harris spread almost immediately. By the time the afternoon session began in the main courtroom, rumors were running wild. The gallery was packed, with some people standing in the back for lack of seats. Judge Blaisdell returned to the bench, his face taut with internal conflict. "I have received information relevant to this case that is classified at the highest levels," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of his decision. "I am weighing a motion from the defense to restrict certain disclosures in the interest of national security. Therefore, I order an immediate recess until tomorrow, during which I will confer with relevant federal agencies to determine how to proceed." Pandemonium broke out in the gallery as reporters sprang to their feet, shouting questions, eager to get any statement they could. Some spectators craned their necks, trying to get a glimpse of Ebony, who sat calmly at the defense table, her composure unshaken. The bailiff repeatedly called for order, but the chaos continued until the judge abruptly left the bench. Moore muttered a curse under his breath as he shoved documents into his briefcase, his glare burning with resentment as he cast a look at Ebony. She met his gaze with unwavering steadiness. For all the scorn and skepticism she had endured, she now had at least part of the weight of the CIA behind her. Whether it was enough remained to be seen. Unbeknownst to Ebony, Moore's office was in a state of near chaos that evening. As soon as the judge announced a recess, Moore retreated to the district attorney's headquarters with half a dozen junior attorneys. They pored over every piece of evidence they had, every witness statement, every shred of rumor, searching for something, anything that could turn the tide in their favor. "How is it possible that she's CIA and no one in our office had any clue?" Moore snarled, slamming a file down onto the conference table. One of his junior lawyers, a woman named Angela Park, spoke hesitantly. "It might be that her records are so highly classified that normal background checks wouldn't reveal anything. The CIA can do that, especially for deep cover operatives." Moore shook his head, refusing to accept that explanation. Could the agency be forging documents to protect her? Is this all a smoke screen? Park gave him a cautious shrug. "I suppose it's possible, but forging official intelligence documents is a major felony. They wouldn't risk it just to save one operative, would they?" Moore paced the conference room floor, his cynicism now tinged with uncertainty. "We can't back down now. If we lose, my career is over. We have to push forward. Highlight every inconsistency we can. If we can't dispute the CIA angle directly, maybe we can prove she abused her position somehow." The team resumed their frantic work, but an undercurrent of doubt now hung in the air, clouding the once clear path Moore believed he was on. For the first time, Moore's confidence was visibly shaken. The steady conviction he had once displayed in court now seemed to waver. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that Ebony Harris might actually be telling the truth, and that he might be attacking a legitimate national hero. Meanwhile, Ebony returned home, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. She couldn't be sure how the judge would rule, but at least the truth had been presented, validated by a high-ranking CIA official. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a flicker of hope. Before bed, she checked her voicemail. There was one message, the trembling voice unmistakably her mother's. "Ebony, I saw the news about the judge getting some file from the CIA. Does that mean you're going to be okay? Call me back when you can. I love you." Ebony swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to overtake her. Overwhelmed by her mother's support, she dialed Charlotte's number. When the call connected, Ebony tried to sound calm, but the emotion seeped through her words. "Hi, Mom. I think I'm going to be fine, maybe better than fine." "Oh, Ebony," Charlotte sighed with relief. "I've been worried sick. The neighborhood's talking about nothing else. But you know what most of them say? They hope you win. You got a lot of folks pulling for you. Thank you. Ebony murmured, the warmth of her mother's comfort washing over her. They talked a little longer about family, the house, Charlotte's health. When the conversation finally ended, Ebony felt lighter. The storm clouds hadn't fully cleared, but she could see a patch of blue sky breaking through. The next day, the courtroom was sealed off for a special in-camera session, meaning the press and public were barred from entry. Only the judge, Ebony, Judith, Moore, and a select representative from the Department of Justice were allowed to remain. Even the court stenographer was replaced by someone with a higher security clearance, ensuring that the transcript of the meeting would be stored in a classified vault. Judge Blaisdell entered the room, wearing a solemn expression. Dr. Harris, Mr. Delaney has submitted a request to present more detailed evidence of your CIA tenure, subject to secrecy protocols. However, it is unusual, unprecedented really, for a local court to handle matters of such high classification. Delaney, seated next to Ebony, spoke clearly. Yes, Your Honor. The agency acknowledges that Dr. Harris served in critical roles. We can confirm she was placed in covert positions across multiple civilian organizations as part of her official duties. These covers were established by the agency and remained sensitive. Disclosing them publicly would compromise ongoing operations, endanger U.S. personnel, as well as foreign assets. Judge Blaisdell turned to the Department of Justice representative, an older woman with stern eyes. Do you concur with this assessment? The woman nodded. We have verified the authenticity of the materials. Your Honor, Dr. Harris's record is classified for good reason. Moore rubbed his forehead, frustration clear on his face. Your Honor, this is precisely the problem. If all these records are sealed, how does the prosecution proceed? We can't possibly cross-examine the accuracy of these allegations if they remain locked away. Blaisdell considered Moore's position. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right, Mr. Moore. But national security interests can supersede the standard discovery rules. Moore shook his head, his frustration mounting. So we're at a stalemate? Judith saw her opening. Not necessarily. We propose that Your Honor review the classified material in its entirety, confirm that Dr. Harris's identity is not fraudulent, and that any anomalies in her publicly available records result from necessary CIA operations. Then, you can issue a directive to dismiss the charges, at least the charges related to fraud and identity misrepresentation. The prosecution can continue with any allegations not covered by the classification. A tense hush fell over the room as the judge tapped his pen on the desk, lost in thought. Finally, Blaisdell spoke. I will examine the classified file thoroughly. However, I must also ensure there is no evidence of wrongdoing on Dr. Harris's part, no personal enrichment or espionage beyond agency mandates. If I find nothing amiss, I will strongly consider the motion to dismiss. Relief radiated through Ebony. At least the judge was willing to entertain the possibility of dismissing the charges. Yet, beneath the relief, an undercurrent of anxiety crept through her. Her entire career, every secret mission, every delicate task she had performed was contained within these documents. Would there be anything in her file that a judge might misinterpret as wrongdoing? The proceedings adjourned, leaving the path forward uncertain but cautiously hopeful. After a frantic night of behind-the-scenes consultations, the judge summoned all parties to reconvene in open court the following morning. The gallery was once again packed, the tension thick in the air, so palpable it almost felt like a physical presence. Judge Blaisdell cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically tired. Having reviewed the classified material submitted by Mr. Delaney and after confer with the Department of Justice, I find that significant portions of Dr. Ebony Harris's background are, in fact, verifiably classified. The documents indicate she has operated under multiple cover identities on behalf of the CIA. As such, many of the so-called discrepancies in her resume are not fraudulent, but are official, albeit covert, components of her service. A murmur of surprise and disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Blaisdell continued, his gaze turning toward the prosecution. Therefore, the court finds the prosecution's primary accusations of fraud and misrepresentation to be unsupported. Given the newly acknowledged classified status of Dr. Harris's records, these charges are hereby dismissed. Ebony's heart soared. A slight smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, though she tried to maintain her composure. Moore, however, was far from pleased. His face flushed with frustration. "Your Honor, this is extraordinary." Moore snapped. "The prosecution has not been allowed to examine these documents. How can we be sure there's no wrongdoing that's merely being concealed under guise of classified status?" Blaisdell responded with measured gravity. "I have personally examined the materials, Mr. Moore. While I cannot disclose their contents, I can assure you that they corroborate Dr. Harris's legitimate government service. The case is effectively closed unless you can produce evidence unrelated to her CIA role that would stand up to scrutiny." Moore stood, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had no such evidence. His entire case had hinged on the assumption that Ebony was lying. He turned to face the gallery, his glare cutting through the room, before he shot one final resentful look at Ebony and her defense team. Without a word, he picked up his briefcase and strode out in silence. A hush of astonishment filled the room as Ebony processed the judge's words. She was free from the weight of the accusations, free to reclaim her life. Yet, the knowledge of her true identity would remain sealed, a quiet footnote in the annals of classified documents. As Ebony, Judith, and Delaney stepped out of the courthouse, the frenzy outside was immediate. Reporters clamored for statements. Microphones were thrust forward, and camera lights blinded them. Delaney, with a polite but firm wave of his hand, steered Ebony away from the crowd. Judith, seizing the opportunity to salvage Ebony's public image, paused briefly. "All charges have been dismissed," she announced confidently. "Dr. Harris has been fully exonerated. The court recognized her history of classified service to our country. That's all we can say for now." The news anchors pivoted from portraying Ebony as a con artist to speculating about her potential status as a secret operative. Pundits who had doubted her existence as anything other than a fraud now debated the missions she might have undertaken. Social media lit up with support for Ebony, with hashtags like #HarrisVindicated and #EbonyHarrisHero trending across platforms. For the public, the spectacle had shifted, but for Ebony, the truth was far simpler. She was simply glad to be free from the oppressive weight of false accusations. Delaney escorted her away from the chaos, and for the first time in a long while, Ebony felt a glimmer of peace as they left the courthouse behind. A black SUV waited at the curb, its government plates and tinted windows gleaming under the morning sun. Ebony slid into the back seat with a quiet nod. "Thank you," she said. "I won't forget what you did." Delaney gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Your service record speaks for itself, Harris. I just did what was necessary." With that, the door shut, and the vehicle eased away from the curb, leaving behind the throngs of reporters in the courthouse that had nearly been her downfall. In the weeks that followed, the backlash against those who had fervently prosecuted Ebony grew intense. Trevor Moore, the prosecutor who had relentlessly pursued her, found himself under investigation for prosecutorial misconduct. Allegations emerged that he had withheld exculpatory evidence, including tips that hinted at Ebony's possible government ties. As details surfaced, Moore's ambition-laden career began to crumble. Public opinion turned on him, calling him overzealous, even vindictive in his pursuit of the case. Elliot Morgan, the man who had testified that Ebony never worked at his research foundation, lost key clients after defenders revealed inconsistencies in his own business practices. A cloud of suspicion now hung over him, as it did for some of the so-called expert witnesses whose reputations were tarnished by their association with a case widely condemned as a rush to judgment, driven by sensational headlines. Mainstream news outlets that had once labeled Ebony as the scammer of the century faced mounting backlash and demands for accountability. Some published retractions or clarifications, but the damage to their credibility was irreversible. Ebony, for her part, tried to tune out the drama. She was thankful for the justice she had received, but she had no interest in indulging in schadenfreude. Once the furor died down, Ebony returned to a semblance of normalcy. The CIA insisted she remain on the payroll, albeit in a less field-intensive role for the time being. She was offered a position at Langley, focused on high-level analysis of foreign intelligence, a job that leveraged her skills but kept her out of the public eye. One afternoon, Ebony drove out to the George Bush Center for Intelligence in Langley, Virginia, for a brief meeting with some top brass. From the outside, the building was unremarkable gray concrete with large windows. But behind those walls were some of the nation's most sensitive secrets. As she passed through security checkpoints, Ebony felt a sense of coming home. She swiped her clearance badge, her new one reflecting her rightful status, and walked down the familiar corridor. Delaney greeted her outside a conference room. "Welcome back, Harris." She offered him a polite smile. "It's good to be back." Inside, she briefed a small team on her specialized knowledge regarding certain hotspots overseas, gleaned from her years of covert operations. As she spoke, Ebony realized how comfortable she felt in this environment, how fulfilling it was to be part of something greater than herself. When the meeting ended, a senior officer, a man Ebony recognized from a distance but had never spoken to directly, approached her. "I read the transcripts of your trial," he said, his voice filled with respect. "Glad you made it through." He paused and added with sincerity, "You did the agency proud." Ebony nodded, humility in her eyes. "Thank you, sir. I'm just doing my job." Outside of her CIA responsibilities, Ebony received invitations from universities and think tanks, each hoping she would speak about government service or resilience under legal scrutiny. She turned down most offers, still wary of any spotlight. But eventually, she accepted an invitation from Georgetown University to give a private lecture on complexities of intelligence work. The lecture was strictly unclassified, focusing on general principles rather than specifics. The event took place in a modest seminar room, not a grand auditorium. About 50 graduate students crowded in, eager to glean insights from someone rumored to have an extraordinary background. Ebony stood at the lectern, flipping through her notes. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and confident as she looked out over the room. "My name is Dr. Ebony Harris," she began, her voice steady and measured. "For many years, I've served in capacities I can't fully disclose. What I can share is that intelligence work, real intelligence work, is not glamorous. It's not like the movies. It's painstaking, often thankless, and almost always shrouded in secrecy. You do it because you believe in something bigger than yourself." The students listened intently, captivated by her words. Ebony's tone was calm, her message thoughtful. She emphasized the ethical dilemmas inherent in covert operations, the sacrifices necessary, and the toll such a life takes on personal relationships. It wasn't a motivational speech promising excitement, but a sober reflection on the costs and rewards of serving one's country in the shadows. When she finished, applause filled the room. For a moment, Ebony allowed herself a quiet smile. It felt good to be heard, to share what little she could, and to be received not with skepticism but with genuine interest and respect. That weekend, Ebony visited her mother at the family home in Maryland. It was a small, cozy house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with a well-kept lawn and flowers lining the walkway. Charlotte greeted her at the door with open arms, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you," Charlotte said, ushering Ebony inside. The living room smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "You did what you had to do." Ebony felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't realized how much the emotional toll of the trial had worn her down until she was safe in her mother's home. "I'm sorry for putting you through all this," she murmured. Charlotte patted her daughter's hand. "You did nothing wrong. If anything, the rest of the world owes you an apology for not trusting you." They spent the afternoon talking about simpler things, family gossip, neighborhood news, and memories from Ebony's childhood. At some point, the conversation returned to the trial. "I never understood how you could handle it all so calmly," Charlotte said softly. Ebony shrugged. "Training, I guess. But it was also your support. Knowing I had something real to come back to kept me steady." Charlotte blinked back tears. "Anytime, baby. Anytime." A few days later, Ebony was alone in her apartment, savoring a rare evening off when her phone buzzed. The caller ID read restricted, a hallmark of agency communications. She pressed accept, and a familiar voice spoke on the other end. "Harris, it's Delaney." Ebony smiled to herself. Good evening, Mr. Delaney. There was a faint hint of anticipation in his tone. We have a situation overseas that might benefit from your expertise. Nothing immediate, but it's on the horizon. You've gained some notoriety. The agency is willing to deploy you again if you're up for it. Ebony looked out the window at the city lights, her mind swirling with thoughts. She considered the sacrifices, the secrets, and the strain of her work. Yet, she also remembered the sense of purpose that had guided her all these years. Without hesitation, she replied, "I'm ready.